before the great, sprawling cities of medieval Europe became little more than open charnel houses, before the majestic rivers of the continent choked on the swollen, floating bodies of the dead, and long before the very air that humanity breathed turned into an invisible poison, there was only the vast, howling, incomprehensible emptiness of the Central Asian steppes. To understand the origin of the apocalypse, one must first understand this landscape. The Eurasian steppe is a geographic monolith, a boundless, rolling ocean of pale, tough grass that stretches relentlessly for thousands upon thousands of miles. It is a world defined by its harsh, unforgiving extremes. In the winter, it is a frozen, white void where the winds howl down from the Arctic, carrying blizzards that can freeze a man solid in his saddle. In the summer, it transforms into a blistering, arid furnace, baking the earth until it cracks. There are no great, sheltering forests here. There are no natural borders to hide behind. It is a landscape that makes a human being feel profoundly, terrifyingly insignificant. For countless centuries, this immense wilderness was the exclusive domain of empires of nomadic horsemen, tribes that lived, fought, and died under a vast, uncaring, and endless sky. They were masters of the bow and the horse, building their temporary lives in tents of animal hide, moving with the seasons, completely detached from the stone-walled cities of the West. But beneath the hooves of their galloping horses, buried deep within the dark, dry, unyielding soil of the steppes, a silent assassin had been sleeping for millennia. This assassin was not an invading army of men. It was not a wrathful, ancient god awakened from a slumber, nor was it a demon born of hellfire and sulfur. It was a microscopic entity, a singular, primitive, single-celled organism. It is known to modern science by a clinical, unassuming name, Yersinia pestis. It is vital to comprehend that this microscopic killer harbored no malice. It possessed no intellect, no hatred for humanity, and no grand design for the destruction of civilization. Yersinia pestis harbored only a blind, mechanical, and absolute biological imperative. It existed entirely to multiply. It was a perfect, cold, biological machine, refined by millions of years of brutal evolution in the dark. For most of its evolutionary history, this bacterium existed in a quiet, isolated equilibrium. Its ancient reservoir, its natural home, was not the human bloodstream, but the deep, labyrinthine underground burrows of the rodents that dotted the arid plains. Specifically, it lived within the populations of the tarbagan marmots and the great gerbils of Central Asia. These creatures lived out their lives in the dusty dark, unaware that they carried a localized, simmering weapon of mass destruction within their subterranean colonies. But Yersinia pestis was a prisoner of its own microscopic scale. It lacked legs, wings, or fins. It could not move across the vast plains on its own. It could not cross rivers or scale mountains. To fulfill its biological destiny, to spread and consume, the bacterium required a vessel. It required an unwitting accomplice to carry it from the darkness of the blood into the wider world. It found this perfect accomplice in an insect so small it is barely visible to the naked eye. The oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis. The flea is an evolutionary marvel of parasitism. It is a creature armored in a hard, chitinous shell, equipped with powerful hind legs capable of launching it distances hundreds of times its own body length. But its most terrifying weapon is its mouth, a complex, microscopic, hypodermic needle designed to pierce flesh, inject a chemical to prevent the blood from clotting, and siphon the warm life force of its host. When a flea fed upon the blood of an infected marmot, it ingested thousands of Yersinia pestis bacteria. And it is here, within the microscopic, dark confines of the flea's digestive tract that the true, terrifying mechanics of the plague were set into motion. Once inside the flea's stomach, the bacteria did not simply pass through. They recognized their environment and began to execute a devastating biological program. The bacteria began to multiply with a terrifying geometric ferocity. One cell became two, two became four, four became millions. As they multiplied, the bacteria secreted a thick, sticky, dark substance, a dense biofilm that clung to the walls of the flea's proventriculus, the valve that connects the esophagus to the stomach. Within days, this sticky, bacterial mass grew so dense and so solid that it completely blocked the flea's digestive tract. The flea was now biologically sabotaged. The insect would experience an insatiable, maddening thirst and a desperate, agonizing hunger. Driven entirely mad by the sensation of starvation, the blocked flea would seek out a host and bite with ferocious, uncharacteristic violence. It would thrust its feeding tube deep into the flesh, frantically pumping its muscular throat to suck up the blood. But the blood could not reach the flea's stomach. It would hit the solid, dark wall of the bacterial blockade. The blood would pool in the esophagus, mixing directly with millions of the plague bacteria. And then, as the starving flea relaxed its muscles, the contaminated blood, now a highly concentrated, lethal broth of Yersinia pestis, was violently regurgitated back down the feeding tube, directly into the open bloodstream of the mammal it had just bitten. The flea would detach, still starving, still desperate, and immediately move to bite again and again and again. A single, blocked flea became a frantic, living syringe, injecting the apocalypse into everything it touched before it finally died of starvation. In the high steppes, this brutal cycle routinely devastated the marmot populations. The rodents would die in massive numbers within their dark burrows, their bodies swelling and blackening. As the bodies of the marmots grew cold, the fleas realized their hosts were dead. Fleas require warm blood to survive. In a desperate panic, the infected, starving fleas would abandon the cooling corpses of the marmots, jumping blindly into the darkness of the burrows. Searching for a new source of heat, they found it in a creature that was not native to the deep steppes, but one that possessed a profound, fatal affinity for human civilization. They found the black rat, Rattus rattus. The black rat was an incredibly adaptable, intelligent, and agile survivor. Unlike the shy, isolated marmots, the black rat thrived in the margins of human existence. It was a creature of the shadows, drawn irresistibly to the warmth of human hearths, the shelter of human architecture, and most importantly, the limitless bounty of human grain. When the starving fleas leapt onto the black rats, the bridge was officially built. The infection had crossed from the isolated wildlife of the Asian plains to a species that walked hand in hand with humanity. The rats, carrying the blocked fleas in their fur, scurried out of the wilderness and toward the scent of civilization. For centuries, this deadly dance between bacteria, flea, and rat remained a localized nightmare. It might wipe out a small nomadic camp or a remote village, but the vast, empty distances of the steppes served as a natural quarantine. The plague simply burned itself out before it could reach the densely populated centers of the world. But the world was changing. The very mechanisms of human progress were inadvertently preparing the path for human annihilation. In the 13th century, a violent, unstoppable force erupted from the eastern steppes. Genghis Khan and his successors forged the mighty Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. Through sheer, terrifying military brilliance, the Mongols conquered everything from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Eastern Europe and down into the deserts of the Middle East. In doing so, they achieved something unprecedented. They unified the vast expanse of Eurasia under a single iron-fisted rule. They created the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, and under this peace, they established and protected a massive, uninterrupted artery of commerce. The Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single paved highway, but a complex, sprawling network of caravan tracks, mountain passes, and desert oases. It was the greatest logistical achievement of the medieval world. Suddenly, the remote, isolated steppes were no longer cut off from humanity. They were the very center of global trade. Massive caravans consisting of hundreds of camels and horses constantly traversed these ancient routes. They carried the unimaginable wealth of the East toward the hungry, growing markets of the West. They carried shimmering rolls of Chinese silk, fine porcelain, precious jade, and heavy, fragrant sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg from the Indies. These caravans moved slowly, methodically, crossing thousands of miles of varied terrain. They stopped at caravanserais, large fortified inns built along the trade routes where merchants rested, watered their animals, and traded goods. And traveling with them, hidden completely out of sight, was the passenger that would end the world. The black rats, seeking warmth in the freezing desert nights, and feeding on the immense supplies of grain carried by the merchants, nested deep within the saddlebags, the bales of silk, and the heavy sacks of spices. And nestled deep within the fur of those rats were the fleas. And blocked within the throats of those fleas was the sleeping, multiplying army of Yersinia pestis. The merchants riding atop their camels, gazing at the horizon, dreaming of the gold they would earn in the markets of Europe, had no idea what they were carrying. They smelled only the sweet, intoxicating scent of nutmeg and cinnamon. They did not smell the putrefaction. They did not hear the frantic, scratching claws of the rats beneath their goods. The veins of the world had been violently torn open by commerce. The isolation of the steppes had been shattered by the desire for luxury. The venom had been drawn up into the syringe, and it was now moving steadily, relentlessly westward. The apocalypse did not announce itself with the blowing of divine trumpets. It did not ride down from the clouds on a pale, spectral horse. It rode in the absolute dark. It rode in the belly of a flea, on the back of a rat, hidden deep within the beautiful, coveted luxuries of a blind and unexpecting humanity. The stage was set. The invisible army was on the march. The great, filthy, overcrowded and utterly defenseless cities of medieval Europe, with their narrow, sunless streets and their populations completely ignorant of microscopic life, were waiting at the end of the road. The journey across the steppes would take years. The rats would breed, the fleas would bite, and the merchants would occasionally fall sick and die, their bodies left by the side of the dusty trails. But the caravans always kept moving forward, driven by the unstoppable engine of human greed and commerce. They were marching toward the Black Sea. They were marching toward the fortified walls of a wealthy trading city named Kaffa. And there, on the shores of the dark water, the slow, quiet journey of the bacteria would finally erupt into a terrifying, deafening explosion of death. The invisible era of the plague was over. The era of the Black Death was about to begin. Aquí tienes la parte 2 del guión, expandida con el mismo nivel de detalle inmersivo, ritmo pausado y descripciones profundas para cumplir con la extensión necesaria. Part 2. The Siege of Kaffa and the Catapults of Death. The true ignition of the global catastrophe did not occur in the quiet corner of a peaceful market. Nor did it begin with a sudden, tragic outbreak among the innocent. The spark that would ultimately burn Europe to the ground was struck in the brutal, unforgiving crucible of medieval warfare. The invisible army of Yersinia Pestis, having travelled thousands of miles across the Silk Road, hidden within the dark bellies of the merchant caravans, finally reached the edge of the Western world. It reached the dark, turbulent shores of the Black Sea. Specifically, it arrived at the Crimean Peninsula, a vital geographic hinge that connected the vast, wild expanses of the Asian steppes to the lucrative, civilized maritime networks of the Mediterranean. Here, jutting out into the cold waters, stood the city of Kaffa. To understand the tragedy of Kaffa is to understand the supreme arrogance of medieval commerce. Kaffa was not a humble village. It was a magnificent, heavily fortified trading colony, entirely owned and operated by the Republic of Genoa. The Genoese were the undisputed masters of the sea, wealthy maritime merchants who built empires, not with massive standing armies, but with gold, naval supremacy, and impenetrable stone architecture. Kaffa was their crown jewel in the east. It was surrounded by massive, towering concentric walls of thick, unyielding stone. Behind these walls lay a city of immense wealth, filled with warehouses overflowing with Russian furs, Indian spices, Chinese silks, and enslaved human beings. The Genoese merchants who walked the paved streets of Kaffa looked out over the flat, dusty plains of the Crimea with a deep sense of superiority. They believed that their high walls, their deep coffers, and their heavy ballistas made them completely untouchable by the nomadic warlords who roamed the lands beyond. But in the year 1346, their arrogance was fiercely challenged. A massive, terrifying dust cloud appeared on the northern horizon. It was the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was a fiercely powerful Mongol Khanate, the direct, blood-soaked descendants of Genghis Khan. Commanded by a ruthless and brilliant warlord named Jani Beg, this army consisted of tens of thousands of hardened cavalrymen. They were warriors born in the saddle, men who drank the blood of their own horses to survive long marches, completely accustomed to the harsh extremes of the steppes. Jani Beg had grown tired of the Genoese merchants controlling the trade routes and defying his taxation. He intended to crush Kaffa, slaughter its inhabitants, and claim the wealth of the Black Sea for the horde. He ordered his vast army to surround the city. The siege of Kaffa began. It was a clash of two entirely different worlds: the immovable, stone-walled wealth of the West against the unstoppable, nomadic fury of the East. For months, the Mongol army battered the walls. They filled the air with whistling storms of arrows. They dragged massive siege engines to the front lines, hurling heavy boulders that shattered against the Genoese fortifications. But the walls of Kaffa held firm. The Genoese defenders, safe behind their stone parapets, fired their crossbows down upon the Mongols, inflicting heavy casualties. Furthermore, because Kaffa was a port city, the Genoese navy controlled the sea. Their galleys could simply sail in, resupply the city with fresh water, food, and reinforcements, and sail out, completely mocking the Mongol blockade on the land. The siege devolved into a grueling, agonizing stalemate. As the seasons changed, the Mongol camp sprawled across the plains outside the city, a massive, foul-smelling, temporary city of leather tents, thousands of horses, and frustrated warriors. And it was into this dense, unsanitary, and crowded encampment that the invisible assassin finally slipped. The black rats, migrating from the infected merchant caravans that supplied the Mongol supply lines, scurried through the tall grass and entered the camp. They burrowed under the leather tents, They nested in the massive piles of grain meant for the horses. And in the dead of the night, while the fierce warriors of the Golden Horde slept on the cold ground, the starving fleas abandoned the rats and began to bite the men. The outbreak was not gradual. It was a sudden, apocalyptic explosion. The great Mongol warriors, men who would laugh in the face of a charging enemy, and who considered a death in battle to be the highest honor, were suddenly struck down by an enemy they could not see, fight, or understand. It began with sudden, violent chills that caused grown men to violently shake in their armor. Then came the fever, a heat so intense it boiled the mind, causing the warriors to hallucinate and scream in the dark. Within 48 hours, the horrifying signature of the plague manifested. Massive, agonizing buboes erupted in their groins and armpits. The skin of these hardened soldiers began to turn a sickly, bruised purple, and then necrotic, pitch black. The psychological terror within the Mongol camp was absolute. This was an army built on martial pride and physical dominance, now reduced to a mass of weeping, helpless, rotting flesh. The shamans chanted, beat their drums, and burned sage to drive away the evil spirits. The healers bled the sick until the sand was soaked black. But the invisible machine of Yersinia pestis could not be reasoned with, frightened, or fought with medieval medicine. The death toll was catastrophic. The Mongol army was literally disintegrating before the walls of Kaffa. Every morning, thousands of new corpses lay in the tents. The air around the camp grew thick with the sweet, sickening, unbearable stench of mass putrefaction. The living were too weak and too terrified to bury the dead. Commander Jani Beg stood in the center of his ruined camp, covering his face with a silk cloth to block the stench. He looked at the impenetrable stone walls of Kaffa in the distance. The Genoese merchants were still safe inside, completely untouched by the horror ravaging his men. He realized, with a bitter, crushing despair, that the siege was lost. His army was broken. He had to order a retreat, or he would die alongside his men in the dirt. But Jani Beg was a Mongol warlord. He was a man of immense pride, ruthless cunning, and absolute vengeance. To retreat without a victory was a profound humiliation. If his men were destined to die in this miserable, forgotten corner of the world, he would ensure that the arrogant merchants of Kaffa died with them. He would not leave them to enjoy their wealth. He would share the nightmare. In a moment of dark, desperate, and horrifying genius, Jani Beg conceptualized one of the first, and undoubtedly the most devastating, acts of biological warfare in human history. He commanded his surviving engineers to prepare the trebuchets. The trebuchet was a terrifying masterpiece of medieval siege engineering. It was a massive, towering structure of heavy timber, utilizing a swinging counterweight and a long, mechanical throwing arm. Usually, the great sling at the end of the arm was loaded with heavy, carved spheres of solid stone, designed to shatter walls and crush buildings. But Jani Beg did not order his men to gather stones. He pointed to the massive, festering piles of his own dead soldiers. "Load them," he commanded. The surviving Mongol warriors, gagging from the stench and trembling with fear, wrapped their faces in cloth and dragged the bloated, rotting, plague-ridden corpses of their brothers in arms toward the massive siege engines. The bodies were stiff, swollen with trapped gases and leaking black, infectious fluids. It was a horrific, agonizing labor. They hauled the heavy, blackened corpses into the leather slings of the trebuchets. The engineers locked the massive wooden gears into place. They raised the heavy counterweights of rock and earth. The wooden beams groaned under the immense mechanical tension. Inside the city of Kaffa, The Genoese defenders stood upon the high stone parapets. They looked out over the Mongol camp. They could see the siege engines being prepared. They tightened their grips on their crossbows, expecting a barrage of heavy stones to rain down upon their roofs. But as the Mongol engineers released the triggers, the sound that echoed across the plains was not the heavy, solid thud of launching stone. It was a sickening, wet, rushing sound. The great throwing arms of the trebuchets snapped violently upward. The Genoese soldiers looked up into the pale sky. They saw dark, misshapen silhouettes launched high into the air, eclipsing the sun. But these silhouettes did not look like boulders. They were strangely limp. They were tumbling, end over end. They had arms, and they had legs. The realization struck the defenders a fraction of a second before the impact. The rotting corpses of the Mongol warriors plummeted over the high stone walls and crashed down into the crowded, narrow streets of Kaffa. The sheer velocity of the fall caused the bloated bodies to violently burst upon the cobblestones. Limbs were shattered, skulls cracked open. The blackened, infected blood, the rotting organs, and the horrific, necrotic pus of the buboes exploded in every direction, splattering against the walls of the houses, the doors of the taverns, and the very faces of the terrified citizens. The psychological shock was paralyzing. It rained human remains. The Genoese merchants, women, and children ran screaming through the streets as corpse after corpse was launched over the walls, raining a storm of putrefaction upon the city. The stench of death instantly overwhelmed the salt air of the sea. The authorities of Kaffa acted as quickly as they could. They ordered the guards to gather the mangled corpses with long pikes and violently hurl them over the cliffs into the dark waters of the Black Sea. They tried to wash the blood from the cobblestones. They believed they were simply cleaning up the gruesome psychological terror tactics of a defeated enemy. They did not understand what had truly happened. They did not understand the invisible cargo that had just been delivered over their impenetrable walls. As the shattered bodies of the Mongol warriors lay in the streets of Kaffa before being thrown into the sea, they grew cold. And as the flesh cooled, the millions of starving, infected fleas, hidden within the folds of their clothing, and their hair realized their hosts were dead. The fleas abandoned the corpses in massive swarms. They leaped blindly into the warm, crowded, bustling streets of the Genoese city. They found the domestic rats that lived in the bakeries and the grain silos. They found the stray dogs. And they found the terrified humans. The biological bomb had successfully detonated. The high stone walls, the heavy crossbows, and the immense wealth of Genoa had proven completely, tragically useless against a microscopic enemy. Within days, the exact same horror that had broken the Mongol army erupted inside the city of Kaffa. The merchants began to shiver. Their fevers spiked. The agonizing black buboes swelled in their armpits and groins. The streets that were once filled with the sounds of haggling and commerce were now filled with the shrieks of the dying and the frantic, echoing prayers of priests who did not understand what demon had possessed the air. Absolute, primal panic took hold of the city. The social order collapsed entirely. The merchants realized that Kaffa was no longer a fortress. It was a sealed tomb. The only escape was the sea. A desperate, violent stampede rushed toward the docks. The wealthiest merchants, the nobles, and the surviving guards abandoned the dying, fighting their way through the narrow streets to reach the galleys moored in the harbour. They threw chests of gold, bolts of silk, and whatever provisions they could carry onto the wooden decks. They boarded the ships, pushing away the sick who begged to be taken with them. They raised the massive anchors. The oarsmen, driven by pure terror, rowed furiously, pulling the heavy galleys away from the docks and out into the open waters of the Black Sea. They raised their sails, catching the wind that blew toward the Mediterranean. As the ship sailed away, the fleeing Italians looked back at the receding silhouette of Caffa. They saw the smoke rising from the city. They breathed a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. They had survived the siege. They had escaped the horror. They were going home to the safety, the light, and the immense wealth of Europe. But as the merchants huddled on the decks, offering prayers of gratitude to the heavens, they were completely oblivious to the darkness stirring beneath their very feet. Deep within the dark, damp, wooden holds of the fleeing galleys, scurrying among the chests of gold and the sacks of grain, were the black rats, and nested deep within the fur of the rats were the starving fleas. The Genoese had not escaped the apocalypse. They had merely become its most efficient vessel. The merchants of Caffa were carrying the end of the world directly into the crowded, unsuspecting heart of Europe. The escape from the besieged city of Caffa felt, for a fleeting, desperately brief moment, like a triumph of human survival, as the heavy wooden galleys of the Genoese merchants pushed away from the burning shores of the Crimean Peninsula and caught the cold winds of the Black Sea. The survivors huddled on the decks and wept tears of profound relief. They had escaped the relentless arrows of the Golden Horde. They had escaped the terrifying, raining corpses launched by the Mongol trebuchets. They watched the smoke of the doomed city fade into the horizon, believing with absolute certainty that they had left death behind them on the Asian shores. But a medieval galley is not merely a vehicle. It is a closed, isolated, and incredibly dense ecosystem. It is a floating wooden island, entirely disconnected from the rest of the world for weeks at a time. Below the main deck, where the wealthy merchants breathed the fresh, salty air of the sea, lay a dark, suffocating, and miserable world. The holds were crammed with heavy chests of trade goods, sacks of grain to feed the crew, and the exhausted, sweating bodies of the oarsmen who rowed in the stifling, humid dark. And hidden deep within those dark, damp holds, scurrying invisibly over the sacks of grain and nesting within the expensive rolls of silk, were the black rats. They had boarded the ships in the panic of the evacuation, bringing with them the starving, blocked fleas, carrying the microscopic apocalypse of Yersinia pestis. For the first few days of the voyage, the sea was calm. The galleys navigated through the treacherous straits of the Bosporus, past the majestic, heavily fortified walls of Constantinople, and entered the vast, sparkling expanse of the Aegean Sea. The merchants began to relax, counting their gold and calculating the immense profits they would make when they finally reached the markets of Italy. Then, deep in the belly of the lead ship, an oarsman collapsed. At first, the overseers assumed it was mere exhaustion, a common occurrence in the brutal conditions of the lower decks. But when they rolled the man over, they recoiled in absolute horror. The oarsman was violently shivering, his skin burning with a sudden, unnatural fever. When they stripped off his sweat-soaked tunic, they saw it. The agonizing, swollen lump in his armpit, hard to the touch and turning a sickly, bruised purple. The black bubo, the signature of the demon they thought they had left behind. The panic that erupted on the galleys was far more terrifying than the panic during the siege of Caffa. During a siege, you can hide behind a stone wall. You can run into a cellar. You can fight back with a sword. But on a wooden ship in the middle of the deep blue Mediterranean, there is absolutely nowhere to run. You are trapped in a floating wooden box with an invisible killer. Within 48 hours, the sickness exploded across the fleet. It moved from the dark holds up to the main deck. The starving fleas, abandoning the dying rats and the dying oarsmen, leapt onto the wealthy merchants, the navigators, and the captains. The disease swept through the confined space with a ferocity that defied belief. The ships became floating hells. The sound of the wind in the sails was entirely drowned out by the agonizing screams of men dying in delirium. The stench of vomit, necrotic flesh, and putrefying blood filled the cramped quarters, mixing sickeningly with the smell of the salt water and the sweet spices stored in the cargo. The surviving crew members, driven to the absolute edge of madness by fear, began dragging the bloated, blackened bodies of their friends and brothers to the rails, heaving them over the side into the sea. The Mediterranean, the cradle of Western civilization, became a watery graveyard. But no matter how many bodies they threw to the waves, the dying did not stop. The fleas were in their clothes, in their bedding, and in the very timber of the ship. By the time the fleet finally reached the Ionian Sea and sighted the coastline of Sicily, the hierarchy of the ships had completely dissolved. There were no longer captains and crew, rich merchants and poor oarsmen. There were only the dead and those who were waiting to die. The ships drifted aimlessly, at the complete mercy of the currents, manned by skeletal, delirious ghosts. It was October, in the year of our Lord, 1347. The bustling, wealthy port city of Messina, situated on the northeastern tip of the island of Sicily, was the gateway to Europe. It was a city bathed in the warm, golden light of the Mediterranean autumn. The docks were a massive, chaotic symphony of medieval life. Thousands of people crowded the waterfront. Dock workers hauling heavy barrels of wine, merchants haggling fiercely over the price of North African grain, sailors shouting in a dozen different dialects, and children running through the cobblestone streets. The people of Messina were profoundly oblivious to the shadow that was falling over the world. They were worried about taxes, about the changing weather, and about the local politics of the Sicilian nobility. They had no idea that the biological history of humanity was about to be violently torn in half. From the horizon, the watchman stationed high in the stone towers of the harbour spotted a small fleet of galleys approaching from the east. But as the ships drew closer, the watchmen lowered their spyglasses, a deep sense of unease settling in their stomachs. The ships looked wrong. They were not approaching with the crisp, organized speed of Genoese merchants eager to reach the market. The massive triangular sails were torn, flapping loosely and aimlessly in the sea breeze. The long, heavy wooden oars, usually synchronized in a beautiful, rhythmic dance of propulsion, were dragging lazily in the water, colliding with one another. The ships were not sailing. They were drifting, carried purely by the tide toward the Sicilian docks. The harbour masters of Messina, suspicious of piracy or plague, ordered the harbour guards into small rowboats. Armed with pikes and carrying torches to cut through the gathering evening mist, they rowed out into the harbour to intercept the drifting, silent galleys. As the small rowboats bumped against the heavy wooden hull of the lead ship, the guards called out, "Identify yourselves. By whose authority do you enter the port of Messina?" There was no answer, only the creaking of the timber and the gentle lapping of the waves. A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the galleys. The harbour master, gripping his sword, ordered his men to throw grappling hooks over the rails. They pulled themselves up the side of the towering ship and cautiously stepped over the wooden bulwark onto the main deck. The sight that greeted them would be burned into the collective nightmare of Europe for centuries. The deck of the ship was a slaughterhouse of the damned. Sprawled across the wooden planks, slumped over the rowing benches, and tangled in the rigging were the rotting, blackened corpses of the Genoese crew. The men had died in the midst of extreme physical agony, their faces frozen in expressions of pure, unadulterated terror. The dark, swollen buboes bulged violently from their necks and groins, bursting through their fine silk clothing. The harbour guards covered their mouths and noses, gagging violently. The stench of concentrated death, confined to the ship for weeks, was a physical blow to the senses. But it was not entirely a ship of the dead. As the guards moved cautiously through the carnage, they heard faint, ragged breathing. A few of the merchants and sailors were still alive. They were huddled in the corners, shivering violently despite the mild autumn air. Their skin was entirely black, the blood pooling beneath the surface as their internal organs hemorrhaged. They reached out with trembling, blackened hands toward the Sicilian guards, their voices reduced to wet, agonizing rasps, begging for water, begging for salvation. The harbour master of Messina did not feel compassion. He felt a primal, absolute, and overwhelming terror. He recognized the smell of an apocalyptic pestilence. He understood instantly that if the cargo of this ship was allowed to touch the soil of Sicily, his city would be annihilated. Back to the boats, he screamed to his men, his voice cracking with panic. Do not touch them. Do not breathe the air. Get back to the boats. The guards scrambled over the rails in a frenzy, tumbling into their rowboats and rowing frantically back toward the docks. The authorities of Messina acted with desperate, ruthless speed. They did not attempt to treat the sick. They did not attempt to offer Christian charity. The survival of the city was paramount. The city magistrates immediately ordered the heavy iron chains of the harbour to be raised. They commanded the local galleys to arm themselves, row out to the Genoese death ships, and physically push them back out into the open sea. Under the threat of flaming arrows and catapult fire from the shore, the delirious, dying survivors on the Genoese ships were forced to slowly turn their galleys around. The people of Messina stood on the docks, holding crosses, praying, and watching as the ghost ships were driven away, cast back out into the dark waters of the Mediterranean. The city magistrates breathed a deep sigh of relief. They believed they had acted swiftly and decisively. They believed that by closing the port and banishing the dying, they had successfully protected Messina from the wrath of God. They went to their beds that night, confident that the walls of their city remained unbreached. It was the most tragic, fatal miscalculation in the history of the European continent. Because the magistrates of Messina were fighting a war against the dying men on the deck, they did not realize that the true enemy was not human. Before the ghost ships were pushed back out to sea, during the few chaotic hours when the galleys were temporarily moored to the wooden pilings of the docks, the heavy, thick hemp ropes had connected the ships to the land. And in the gathering twilight, completely unseen by the panicked guards and the shouting harbour masters, the true architects of the apocalypse made their move. The black rats, sensing that the ships were filled with nothing but corpses and that the food in the holds had run out, smelled the immense, bursting grain silos of Messina just a few hundred yards away. Operating entirely in the shadows, thousands of rats scurried out of the dark holds of the galleys. They ran along the wooden rails, their claws clicking softly against the timber. They reached the thick hemp mooring lines. Like highly trained acrobats, the rats scrambled down the ropes, crossing the gap between the floating hell of the ships and the solid, safe ground of Sicily. They hit the docks. They vanished into the dark, narrow alleyways of the port. They scurried into the cellars of the taverns, up the walls of the brick houses, and into the massive, warm storehouses filled with the autumn harvest. And nestled deep within their fur, completely invisible to the human eye, were the starving, infected fleas, carrying millions upon millions of Yersinia pestis bacteria. The Genoese ships had been banished, but it did not matter. The cargo had already been unloaded. For a few days, the city of Messina went about its normal, bustling life. The merchants traded, the children played, and the priests gave thanks to God for delivering them from the plague ships. The weather remained beautiful. The danger seemed to have passed like a dark cloud blowing over the sun. But beneath the floorboards, in the walls, and in the dark corners of the bedrooms, the rats began to die. The bacteria multiplied. The fleas, starving and desperate, abandoned the dead rodents and leaped onto the soft, warm skin of the sleeping citizens of Messina. The invisible invasion was complete. The biological bomb had been planted in the very heart of the Mediterranean. The fuse had been lit in the dark. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and within a matter of days, the city of Messina would be transformed from a thriving, wealthy paradise into an unimaginable, inescapable slaughterhouse, signaling the absolute end of the medieval world. For a few deceptive days after the Genoese galleys were banished from the harbour, the golden autumn sun continued to shine upon the port city of Messina. The markets opened, the church bells rang, and the people breathed the salty air of the Mediterranean, believing themselves to be the victors over a terrible maritime nightmare. They did not know that the true nightmare was already inside their homes, crawling beneath their floorboards, and hiding within the very clothes folded in their wooden chests. The apocalypse did not announce its arrival with the blowing of celestial trumpets or the crashing of earthquakes. It began in the absolute silence of the night, with an event so small, so infinitesimally trivial, that the victims did not even wake from their slumber. It began with the bite of a flea. A tiny, sharp prick on the ankle, the wrist, or the neck. A momentary itch brushed away in the dark by a sleepy hand. But in that fraction of a second, the microscopic, dark barricade within the starving flea's throat was violently regurgitated. Thousands of Yersinia pestis bacteria were injected directly into the warm, flowing bloodstream of a human being. To truly understand the sheer, paralyzing terror of the Black Death, one must strip away the macro history of empires and trade routes and look closely at the horrific, unrelenting physical destruction it inflicted upon the human body. The people of the 14th century had absolutely no concept of bacteria. They had no knowledge of immune systems, white blood cells, or microscopic pathogens. They only knew the symptoms. And the symptoms were a rapid, agonizing descent into a biological hell. The disease had an incubation period of 2 to 6 days. During this time, the victim walked the streets, ate their meals, and embraced their children, completely unaware that a microscopic army was multiplying exponentially within their veins. And then, the illusion of health was shattered. It almost always began with a sudden, violent shiver, a bone-deep, uncontrollable shaking that no amount of wool blankets or roaring hearth fires could warm. This was immediately followed by a headache of such blinding, crushing intensity that victims would routinely bang their own skulls against the stone walls of their homes in a desperate attempt to distract themselves from the agony inside their brains. Then came the fever, the body's natural defense mechanism, attempting to burn the infection away, would spike the internal temperature to fatal heights. The heat was so intense, it boiled the mind, plunging the victim into states of terrifying, vivid delirium. Men and women would thrash in their beds, screaming at phantoms, their eyes rolling back into their heads, their skin burning to the touch. But the true, unmistakable signature of the apocalypse, the physical manifestation that struck absolute primal terror into the hearts of anyone who saw it, appeared on the second or third day. As the bacteria multiplied, they drained into the body's lymphatic system. The lymph nodes, acting as the final, desperate filters of the immune system, became entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the multiplying bacteria. The nodes began to swell. They swelled in the groin, in the armpits, and along the sides of the neck. These massive, horrific swellings were known as buboes. They grew rapidly, expanding from the size of an almond to the size of an egg, and often to the size of a large apple or a grapefruit. The buboes were stretched agonizingly tight. The skin stretched so thin it appeared translucent. They were completely engorged with a toxic, pressurized mixture of necrotic blood, liquefied tissue, and billions of plague bacteria. The physical pain of the buboes was described by survivors as being worse than the tortures of the Inquisition. The swellings were so exquisitely sensitive that even the lightest brush of a linen bedsheet would cause the victim to shriek in agony. Those afflicted could not walk, they could not lower their arms, and they could not turn their heads. They lay paralyzed in their own beds, trapped in a state of excruciating, unyielding torture. As the buboes continued to grow, the flesh surrounding them began to die while the victim was still breathing. The skin would turn a sickly, bruised purple, and then, as the blood vessels burst and the tissue necrotized, the flesh would turn pitch black. Dark, heavy spots would appear across the chest, the back, and the limbs, bruises of dead blood pooling beneath the skin. This horrifying, visible blackening of the living flesh is what ultimately gave the apocalypse its eternal, terrifying name, the Black Death. At this stage, the stench of the victim became unbearable. It was the heavy, sweet, sickening scent of a corpse that was still drawing breath. The body was literally rotting from the inside out. Within 5 to 8 days of the initial shiver, the heart would finally, mercifully give out, and the victim would die in a pool of their own black fluids. This was the bubonic plague. It was brutal, it was agonizing, and it killed up to 80% of everyone it infected. But it was only the beginning. As the disease ravaged the densely packed, poorly ventilated cities of Europe, the bacteria adapted. It found a new, even faster pathway to destruction. If the Yersinia pestis bacteria managed to reach the lungs of a victim, it mutated from a blood-borne pathogen into a respiratory nightmare. It became the pneumonic plague. With the emergence of the pneumonic strain, the rats and the fleas were no longer necessary. The disease had weaponized the very air. If a victim whose lungs were filling with the bacteria let out a single wet cough, or even sneezed in a crowded market square, they aerosolized the pathogen. A microscopic mist of infected blood and saliva would drift through the air, completely invisible. If a healthy person walking past simply took a deep breath, the bacteria would enter their lungs directly. The pneumonic plague was terrifyingly fast. There was no time for the agonizing buboes to form in the armpits or the groin. The bacteria immediately began to destroy the delicate, spongy tissue of the lungs. The victim would suddenly begin to gasp for air, feeling a heavy, crushing weight upon their chest. They would develop a violent, hacking cough, bringing up thick, frothy sputum that quickly turned into bright red, arterial blood. Within a matter of hours, the lungs would entirely fill with fluid. The victims of the pneumonic plague did not die of a fever. They drowned. They drowned in their own beds, in the middle of dry land, their lips turning blue as they fought frantically and uselessly for a single breath of air. The pneumonic plague was almost 100% fatal, and it could kill a perfectly healthy man in less than 2 days. It turned families against each other. A mother could not comfort her coughing child without inhaling her own death. A priest could not lean in to hear the final confession of a dying man without breathing in the apocalypse. And yet, there was a third, even more terrifying manifestation of the disease, the septicemic plague. This occurred when a massive, overwhelming quantity of the bacteria was injected directly into the bloodstream, multiplying so fast that the body had absolutely no time to mount a defense. There were no buboes. There was no coughing of blood. The bacteria simply turned the blood itself into a toxic, clotting sludge. The suddenness of the septicemic plague shattered the human mind. A person could wake up in the morning feeling perfectly healthy. They could eat their breakfast, walk out their front door to go to the market, and suddenly feel dizzy. Within minutes, the toxins would trigger massive systemic blood clotting, followed immediately by severe internal hemorrhaging. The victim would collapse onto the cobblestones, bleeding simultaneously from their nose, their mouth, their eyes, and their pores. They would be dead before the church bells rang for noon. Faced with this three-headed, unstoppable monster, the people of Europe turned desperately to the only men they believed could save them, the physicians. But the tragedy of the 14th century was that medieval medicine was completely, profoundly, and hopelessly useless against the plague. The physicians of the era were highly educated men, trained in the great universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. But their entire understanding of the human body was based on the ancient, flawed texts of the Greek physician Galen, written 1,000 years prior. They believed that human health was governed by the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these fluids, triggered by astrological alignments, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the house of Aquarius, or by miasma, pockets of foul, corrupted air that blew up from the swamps or the cracks in the earth. Armed with this tragic ignorance, the physicians went to war against the Black Death, and their treatments were often as horrific as the disease itself. To restore the balance of the humours, the standard medical procedure was bloodletting. The physicians would take razor-sharp lancets and slice open the veins of the plague victims, draining pints of thick, dark blood into brass bowls. They believed they were draining the sickness. In reality, they were draining the last, desperate reserves of strength from dying patients, accelerating their deaths and simultaneously exposing themselves and their tools to the highly infectious blood. When bloodletting failed, they turned to the buboes. Believing the poison was trapped inside the massive swellings, physicians would attempt to draw it out. They would take red-hot irons and brutally cauterize the buboes, burning the living flesh of the screaming victims. Or they would take unwashed knives and slice the buboes wide open, attempting to squeeze the necrotic pus out with their bare hands. To pack these open, gaping wounds, the medieval apothecaries concocted terrifying remedies. They would crush emeralds and pearls into powder and mix it with tree resin. They would slice live pigeons in half and press the bleeding, still beating organs of the bird directly against the open plague sores. In the most desperate cases, physicians would mix human excrement with the dried, crushed bodies of toads, plastering the foul mixture onto the wounds, virtually guaranteeing a secondary, lethal bacterial infection, even if the patient somehow survived the plague. To combat the miasma, the corrupted air, the authorities ordered massive bonfires of sweet-smelling woods, pine, cedar, and juniper, to be burned in the city streets day and night. People walked through the infected cities, holding small, perforated silver boxes filled with rose petals, camphor, and ambergris directly under their noses, believing that if they could not smell the stench of the rotting corpses, The disease could not enter their lungs. It was a pathetic, fragile shield of flowers raised against an unstoppable biological tidal wave. Nothing worked. Absolutely nothing. The realization of this total medical failure was perhaps the most crushing psychological blow to the people of Europe. The physicians, the most educated, respected, and highly paid men in society, were dying at the exact same staggering rate as the illiterate peasants in the fields. The plague did not respect education. It did not respect wealth. It did not respect the heavy gold chains of the nobility or the velvet robes of the kings. The Black Death was the ultimate, terrifying equalizer. It swept through the grand palaces of the aristocracy with the exact same merciless efficiency as it swept through the mud-floored hovels of the poor. The walls of the castles, designed to withstand the siege engines of rival armies, could not keep out the fleas. The heavy, iron-bound doors of the monasteries could not keep out the aerosolized blood. The people of Europe realized, with a cold, absolute despair, that there was no earthly salvation. The science of man had failed them entirely, and as the corpses began to pile up in the streets, blocking the doorways of the very hospitals built to save them, the survivors turned their terrified eyes toward the heavens. If the physicians could not stop the apocalypse, then surely it must be the wrath of God. And if it was the wrath of God, the only remaining cure was extreme, brutal, and absolute penance. As the physical bodies of the European populace blackened and dissolved under the microscopic onslaught of Yersinia pestis, a secondary, equally terrifying dissolution began to occur. The physical destruction of the human form was perfectly mirrored by the absolute, devastating collapse of the human spirit and the very fabric of civilization. Before the plague, medieval Europe was a world bound tightly together by rigid, ancient hierarchies. It was a world constructed upon the absolute authority of the Church, the strict enforcement of the law by the nobility, and above all, the sacred, unbreakable bonds of the family. But as the death toll climbed from the thousands into the hundreds of thousands, and then into the millions, these invisible pillars of society simply evaporated. They were burned away by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the terror. The great cities of the continent, Paris, London, Venice, and Florence, did not go down fighting. They simply stopped functioning. The bustling markets, once vibrant with the shouting of merchants and the vibrant colors of trade, fell completely silent. The heavy wooden doors of the artisan guilds were shuttered and locked. The great stone cathedrals, which had taken centuries to build, echoed only with the frantic, terrified whispers of the dying. The silence that fell over Europe was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a massive continental graveyard waiting for the dirt to be thrown over it. The most profound and unnatural casualty of the Black Death was not the economy, nor the government. It was the death of human empathy. In the face of an invisible killer that could jump from a dying husband to a healthy wife with a single aerosolized cough, the primal instinct for self-preservation violently overrode the most basic biological laws of love. The great Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the absolute nightmare of the outbreak in the streets of Florence, recorded this psychological shattering with a trembling pen. The terror was such, Boccaccio wrote in his masterpiece, The Decameron, that brother abandoned brother. The uncle abandoned the nephew. The wife abandoned the husband. And what is worse and nearly incredible, fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their own children as if they had not been theirs. Imagine the sheer depth of psychological terror required to break the maternal instinct. Imagine a mother hearing the sudden, hacking cough of her young son in the middle of the night. She approaches his small wooden bed with a candle. She sees the sweat upon his brow, and she pulls back the linen sheet to see the dark, swollen lump forming in his groin. In any other era, a mother would hold her child, stroke his hair, and comfort him as he passed. But in the year 1348, the mother looked at her infected child and saw only the apocalypse. Driven entirely mad by the fear of suffocating on her own blood, she would slowly back away. She would walk out of the bedroom, close the heavy wooden door, and run out into the dark streets, abandoning her own flesh and blood to die alone, screaming for water in the dark. This tragic severing of the family unit meant that the sick were left completely unattended. Hundreds of thousands died not only of the plague itself, but of simple dehydration and starvation. Unable to lift themselves from their beds to reach a cup of water, with no one left brave enough to cross their threshold to help them. As the bodies began to pile up inside the locked homes, a horrifying logistical nightmare presented itself. There was simply no longer enough living people to bury the dead. For centuries, the Christian tradition of burial was a sacred, highly organized ritual. A person died. The priest administered the last rites. The church bells tolled to announce the passing to the community, and the body was gently laid to rest in the consecrated ground of the churchyard, facing east to await the resurrection. But the Black Death shattered this sacred rhythm within weeks. The consecrated ground of the churchyards filled to bursting. The grave diggers, handling the highly infectious corpses, were among the very first to die. Soon the church bells, which had been ringing continuously day and night, were ordered to stop. The constant, unending tolling was driving the survivors to the brink of absolute madness, a never-ending auditory reminder that their turn was coming. With the churchyards full and no gravediggers left, the bodies were simply left in the streets. Every morning, the few brave or desperate men who survived, often the poorest of the poor or criminals offered pardons, would drive heavy wooden carts through the silent, misty streets. They would shout the terrifying, echoing refrain, "Bring out your dead." The corpses were dragged out of the houses by their feet and thrown onto the wooden carts like rotting firewood. When the carts were full, they were not taken to individual graves. The authorities ordered the digging of massive, gaping trenches outside the city walls. These plague pits were scars carved deep into the earth. The bodies were dumped into the trenches, naked and anonymous. Because space was running out, they were packed with horrifying efficiency. An observer in Florence noted that the bodies were layered in the pits, like layers of cheese in a lasagna. A row of blackened, rotting corpses was laid down. A thin dusting of soil was thrown over them, and the next row of corpses was laid directly on top, continuing until the trench was filled to the very brim. In the papal city of Avignon, the death toll was so catastrophic that even the massive trenches were not enough. Pope Clement VI, trapped inside his grand palace, was forced to consecrate the entire Rhone River. He declared the flowing water to be holy ground, so that the endless lines of wooden carts could simply back up to the riverbanks and dump thousands of bloated corpses directly into the rushing currents. The stench of rotting human flesh settled over the European continent like a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was a smell that permeated the clothing, the food, and the very pores of the survivors. In the midst of this unimaginable horror, the institutions of power completely dissolved. The city magistrates, the judges, and the politicians, the men meant to uphold the law, were the first to flee. They abandoned the cities, loading their wealth onto carriages and retreating to their isolated country estates, hoping the clean air of the mountains would save them. With the authorities gone, the law evaporated. The city gates were left completely unguarded. Prisons were abandoned, the jailers having died or fled, leaving the inmates to either starve in their cells or break out and roam the empty streets. Thieves broke into the grand palaces of the dead nobility, stealing gold, jewels, and fine tapestries. But the thieves soon realized a bitter, terrifying truth. Their stolen gold was completely useless. There was no one left alive to buy their goods, and a chest of rubies could not purchase a single loaf of bread or a cure for the swelling in their armpits. But the most devastating institutional collapse was the failure of the Holy Mother Church. In the 14th century, the Catholic Church was the absolute center of human existence. It governed not just the politics of the world, but the eternal destination of the human soul. To die without confessing one's sins to a priest and without receiving the last rites meant an eternity of unimaginable torture in the fires of hell. But as the plague raged, the parish priests found themselves on the absolute front lines of the biological war, because it was their sacred duty to lean closely over the beds of the sick to hear their whispered confessions. The priests inhaled the aerosolized pneumonic plague constantly. The mortality rate among the clergy was staggeringly high. Entire monasteries were wiped out to the last monk. Soon, the surviving priests, terrified of the invisible demon, simply stopped answering the calls of the dying. They locked the heavy doors of the churches. They refused to visit the sick. The psychological devastation this caused among the deeply religious populace cannot be overstated. Men and women lay in their beds, their bodies turning black, weeping not just in physical agony, but in absolute paralyzing terror for their eternal souls. They believed they were dying unshriven, condemned to the abyss because their shepherds had abandoned them to the wolves. The situation became so desperate that the Pope issued a decree stating that the dying could confess their sins to anyone who was present, even to a woman. And if no one was there, they could confess their sins directly to God, granting a blanket absolution to all victims of the plague. Faced with the complete collapse of the family, the law, and the church, the surviving human psyche fractured. The people of Europe, trapped in a waking nightmare with no exit, split into two entirely divergent, equally mad responses to the apocalypse. The first response was absolute, nihilistic hedonism. If the physicians could not save you, if the priests had abandoned you, and if you were practically guaranteed to be thrown into a mass grave before the end of the week, why bother obeying the laws of God or man? A terrifying, manic nihilism swept through the surviving populations. Men and women abandoned their homes and occupied the empty, luxurious mansions of the dead nobility. They broke into the wine cellars. Taverns never closed. The streets were filled with people engaging in wild, desperate public orgies. They drank from the golden goblets of dead dukes. They dressed in the stolen velvet of dead queens. And they danced wildly around the bonfires of sweet-smelling wood. It was a macabre, hysterical celebration of the doomed. They reasoned that if the world was ending, they would drown themselves in every earthly pleasure available to them. They laughed in the face of the corpses, singing bawdy songs, while the death carts rolled past, numbing their sheer, absolute terror with wine and flesh. The second response was the exact, terrifying opposite. It was a descent into extreme, brutal, and fanatical religious penance. For many, the hedonism of the taverns was the exact reason the plague had arrived. They believed the Black Death was not a disease of the blood, but a direct, physical manifestation of the wrath of a furious God, sent to punish humanity for its vanity, its greed, and its sins. And if God was angry, the only way to appease him was to demonstrate that humanity was willing to punish itself. From this dark theology emerged one of the most terrifying spectacles of the Middle Ages, the movement of the flagellants. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Cross. They organized into massive processions, sometimes numbering in the thousands. They dressed entirely in dark, heavy robes, with large red crosses painted on their chests and backs. They pulled their cowls deep over their faces, hiding their identities, rendering them an anonymous, terrifying army of suffering. They marched barefoot from town to town, entirely abandoning their lives and families. They carried heavy wooden crosses, and in their hands they held their instruments of salvation, the scourge. It was a heavy leather whip, the tails knotted and tipped with sharp pieces of iron, nails, and broken glass. When the procession entered a town square, they would form a massive circle. The church bells would ring, and the townsfolk would gather around, watching in mesmerized horror. The flagellants would strip off their heavy robes, exposing their bare backs to the cold air. They would fall to their knees, weeping and chanting ancient, mournful hymns in Latin, begging God for mercy. And then, in perfect, terrifying unison, they would raise the heavy leather whips and bring them crashing down upon their own backs. The sound was sickening. The sharp iron barbs bit deeply into their flesh, tearing the skin and muscle. They whipped themselves with such ferocious, fanatical violence that the blood would literally spray into the air, splattering against the stone walls of the surrounding churches and the faces of the terrified onlookers. The ritual required them to whip themselves 3 times a day for 33.5 days, 1 day for every year that Jesus Christ walked the earth. They beat themselves until their backs were reduced to raw, pulverized, infected meat. The people of the towns watched these bleeding zealots with profound awe and terror. Many believed the flagellants were holy men, martyrs taking the sins of the world upon their own bleeding shoulders. Desperate mothers would bring cloths to soak up the blood of the flagellants, believing it possessed miraculous healing properties. But the terrifying, tragic irony of the flagellants was that they were not saving Europe. They were actively destroying it. As these massive bands of bleeding, sweating men traveled from one infected town to a clean village, they brought the apocalypse with them. The starving fleas traveled in their heavy robes. Furthermore, their own open, massive, bleeding wounds were perfect breeding grounds for the bacteria. They were walking, chanting super spreaders of the septicemic plague. They believed they were shedding their blood to appease God, but in reality, they were painting the roads of Europe with the very pathogen that was killing them. Europe was no longer a civilization. It was a chaotic, surreal purgatory. On one side of the street, the hedonists drank wine and danced in the stolen clothes of the dead. On the other side, the flagellants tore their own flesh to pieces in pools of blood. And down the center of the street, the wooden carts rolled endlessly, carrying the blackened, rotting victims to the mass graves. The human mind, stretched beyond its absolute limits, could not sustain this level of terror without seeking a release valve. If God could not be appeased, and if the disease could not be cured, the terrified, grieving masses realized they needed an earthly enemy. They needed someone to blame for the overflowing trenches and the agonizing deaths of their children. The invisible bacteria was too abstract. They wanted flesh and blood to punish. The era of the plague was about to birth an era of unimaginable, organized cruelty. The search for the scapegoats had begun. When human beings are confronted with an incomprehensible, overwhelming, and invisible terror, the architecture of the mind begins to fracture. The human psyche is fundamentally incapable of accepting absolute chaotic meaninglessness. If the crops fail, if the rivers flood, and if children die bleeding from their eyes in a matter of hours, the terrified mind desperately demands a narrative of cause and effect. It demands a reason, and most importantly, it demands an enemy. The invisible nature of Yersinia pestis was the ultimate psychological torment for the people of the 14th century. They could not fight a bacterium. They could not put a microscopic organism on trial, and they could not execute a foul wind. The wrath of God was a terrifying concept, but it was too vast, too abstract, and too untouchable. Furthermore, as the flagellants bled themselves in the streets and the parish priests died by the thousands, it became horrifyingly clear that divine penance was not stopping the apocalypse. Therefore, the terrified, grieving masses reasoned that if the plague was not a natural disaster, and if it was not the righteous judgment of God, it must be the deliberate, orchestrated, and organized malice of mortal men. They needed flesh and blood to punish. They needed a physical target for the blinding, suffocating rage that accompanied their grief. From this desperate psychological void, a dark, paranoid madness was born. A hysteria swept across the European continent that was, in its own way, far more insidious and deeply evil than the biological disease itself. It began as a whisper in the terrified, isolated villages of southern France, and quickly grew into a deafening, continent-wide roar. A rumor began to spread, carried by frantic refugees fleeing the dying cities. The rumor claimed that the Black Death was not a sickness of the air, but a highly coordinated act of mass murder. The story alleged that a vast, secret network of enemies was deliberately poisoning the waterwells, the rivers, and the natural springs of Europe. The details of this phantom poison were as macabre as they were absurd. It was whispered that the concoction was a demonic powder made from the crushed bodies of spiders, the dried venom of toads, the powdered entrails of bats, and the desecrated flesh of human corpses. The mobs, fueled by absolute terror and armed with torches, pitchforks, and heavy axes, began to hunt. Their first targets were the marginalized, the outsiders, and the defenseless. They fell upon the lepers. Leprosy was already viewed as a visible curse, and leper colonies were situated on the outskirts of the towns. The mobs dragged the sick from their isolated huts, accusing them of conspiring with the devil to spread the new plague, and slaughtered them without trial. They targeted foreign travelers, pilgrims passing through on the roads, and the wandering beggars who had no families to protect them. Anyone who looked different, spoke with a strange accent, or behaved with suspicion was immediately seized, beaten to death in the cobblestone streets, and thrown into the rivers. But the mob's thirst for blood was not satisfied by killing a few wandering beggars. To explain a conspiracy of this unimaginable, apocalyptic magnitude, they required a larger, more established, and deeply entrenched enemy. They turned their collective, murderous gaze upon the Jewish populations of Europe. To understand the sheer, catastrophic violence that was about to unfold, one must look at the centuries of deeply ingrained, institutionalized prejudice that had been festering beneath the surface of medieval society. The Jewish people of Europe had long been forced into marginalized positions. By the decrees of the Catholic Church, they were barred from owning land, entering the artisan guilds, and holding public office. The only professions left open to them were trade, medicine, and money lending. As the Church strictly forbade Christians from the practice of usury or lending money with interest, this forced economic isolation meant that many Christian nobles, city magistrates, and peasant farmers were deeply in debt to Jewish creditors. Beneath the religious fanaticism of the mobs lay a cold, calculating, and ruthless economic motive. If you accuse your creditor of a capital crime and you burn him at the stake, your debts are instantly reduced to ash. Furthermore, the Jewish communities often lived in segregated neighborhoods or ghettos, bound by the strict, ancient laws of the Torah and the Talmud. They practiced stringent dietary laws and deep rituals of personal hygiene. They were commanded to wash their hands before eating, to bathe regularly, and to bury their dead swiftly and carefully. In the filth-ridden, unsanitary landscape of medieval Europe, where bathing was often considered a luxury or even a medical hazard by Christians, these practices of cleanliness may have offered the Jewish communities a fractional, slight mitigation against the fleas and the rats. But to the terrified, paranoid eyes of the Christian mobs, this separation and cleanliness did not look like hygiene. It looked like dark magic. It looked like immunity. The rumor mill mutated into a targeted, lethal weapon. The story was solidified. The Jewish elders, communicating through a secret network spanning from Spain to Germany, were supposedly brewing the toxic powder and paying agents to drop it into the Christian wells under the cover of darkness. The authorities did not try to stop the madness. They legalized it. In the Duchy of Savoy, located in the Alps, the local magistrates arrested a group of Jewish physicians and merchants. They dragged them down into the cold, damp, lightless stone cellars of the local castles and subjected them to the horrific machinery of medieval torture. The victims were strapped to the rack, their joints slowly, agonizingly dislocated by turning gears. They were hoisted into the air by their wrists, their arms pulled from their sockets in the strappado. Their bare feet were held to burning coals. Under this excruciating, mind-shattering pain, the human body will inevitably break. A man will say absolutely anything, admit to any crime, and name any accomplice to make the agony stop. The torturers extracted the false, coerced confessions they desperately sought. The victims, weeping in agony, confessed that they had received the poisonous powder from rabbis in Toledo, and that they had personally dropped it into the wells of the surrounding valleys. These confessions were meticulously written down by the scribes, sealed with hot wax, and carried by fast couriers on horseback across the Alps, distributed to the mayors and city councils of Germany, France, and Switzerland. The rumor was no longer a frantic whisper in the taverns. It had become official, documented, legal truth. The mobs now had their mandate. What followed was a campaign of ethnic cleansing so brutal, so organized, and so devastating that it would not be rivaled in its localized ferocity until the darkest days of the 20th century. From the Rhone Valley to the dark forests of the Rhineland, a wave of horrific pogroms was unleashed. Jewish communities that had existed peacefully in these cities for hundreds of years were completely eradicated in a matter of days. In the city of Basel, the Jewish population was chained inside a wooden barn on an island in the Rhine River, and the barn was set entirely ablaze. In Frankfurt, the Jewish community, realizing the mob was coming, set their own homes on fire and threw themselves into the flames rather than be tortured and torn apart by the rioters. But the absolute, horrific zenith of this madness, the event that stands as a monument to the supreme cruelty of the desperate human animal, occurred in the wealthy, powerful city of Strasbourg. It was February of the year 1349. The winter was bitterly cold, the skies grey and heavy with impending snow. The terrifying paradox of Strasbourg was that the Black Death had not yet even arrived within its walls. The plague was still miles away, ravaging the surrounding countryside. But the panic had already breached the gates. The mayor of Strasbourg, a rational man named Konrad von Winterthur, attempted to protect the Jewish citizens of his city. He pointed out the obvious absurdity of the rumors. The plague was transmitted through the air. It struck places where there were no wells, and the Jewish people were dying at the exact same terrifying rate as the Christians. He ordered guards to protect the Jewish quarter. But the local artisan guilds, the butchers, the bakers, and the nobility, many of whom owed massive financial debts to the Jewish moneylenders, saw an opportunity. They rallied the terrified populace, fueled them with wine and religious fervor, and staged a violent, armed uprising. They overthrew the mayor, removed the city council, and installed a new government whose sole immediate mandate was the absolute extermination of the Jews. On Friday, the 13th of February, the new city authorities ordered the arrest of every single Jewish man, woman, and child within the walls of Strasbourg. They were dragged from their homes, stripped of their weapons, and imprisoned. The next morning, February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, the captives were marched through the freezing cobblestone streets. The mob lined the avenues, screaming curses, throwing stones, and spitting upon the terrified families. They were led out of the city gates and into the local cemetery. There, in the freezing winter air, the authorities had constructed a massive, towering wooden platform. It was a scaffold of unimaginable size, built directly over a vast pit filled with dry timber, straw, and pitch. 2,000 human beings, mothers holding their infants, elderly scholars clutching their sacred texts, young men and terrified children, were herded onto the massive wooden structure. The magistrates of Strasbourg rode forward on their horses and delivered a final, cruel ultimatum. Any Jew who was willing to renounce their faith, step down from the platform, and be immediately baptized as a Christian would be spared. A few, their minds completely shattered by the sheer, looming terror of the flames, broke down, renounced their faith, and were pulled from the crowd. But the vast, overwhelming majority of the Jewish captives demonstrated a bravery that defies mortal comprehension. Facing the absolute certainty of an agonizing death, they held fast to their dignity, their identity, and their God. They locked arms. They began to chant their ancient prayers, their voices rising into the cold, grey sky, drowning out the screams of the mob. The torches were thrown. The dry timber and the pitch ignited with a deafening roar. The flames shot upward, instantly engulfing the massive wooden platform. The heat was so intense, it forced the mob to step back. The screams of 2,000 innocent souls trapped in the inferno echoed off the stone walls of the city. The thick, black smoke choked the winter sky, casting a dark, horrific shadow over the snow-covered ground. It took hours for the massive pyre to burn down. The wood collapsed, burying the victims under tons of burning ash and glowing red embers. But the mob did not disperse in solemn silence. The moment the heat became bearable, the true, dark motive of the massacre revealed itself. The citizens of Strasbourg took up rakes and iron shovels. They waded directly into the still smouldering, smoking ashes of the dead. They were not looking for survivors. They were sifting through the charred bones and the burned flesh, frantically searching for the gold coins, the silver jewelry, and the precious stones that the victims had hidden in their clothes. Simultaneously, back within the walls of the city, the magistrates broke into the abandoned Jewish homes. They systematically gathered every single ledger, every contract, and every record of financial debt owed by the Christians to the murdered Jews. They carried the heavy parchment books to the center of the town square, threw them onto a massive bonfire, and watched the debts turn to ash. The massacre of Strasbourg was complete. The city had cleansed itself of the supposed poisoners. The debts were erased, and the gold was distributed among the murderers. They believed they had saved their city from the apocalypse. Pope Clement VI, sitting in his palace in Avignon, was horrified by the massacres. He issued a papal bull explicitly condemning the violence, stating clearly that the Jews were entirely innocent. He pointed out the unassailable logic. The plague struck regions of the world where no Jews lived, and it killed the Jewish people as indiscriminately as the Christians. He ordered the bishops of Europe to protect the innocent and excommunicate the murderers. But the voice of the Pope was completely drowned out by the roar of the mobs and the crackling of the pyres. The massacres continued until there were virtually no Jewish communities left in Western Europe, forcing the survivors to flee en masse toward the east, into the sprawling, welcoming territories of Poland, fundamentally altering the demographic map of the continent for the next 6 centuries. Yet, the ultimate tragic irony of the scapegoating was soon revealed. The pyres of Strasbourg slowly cooled. The winter snow finally fell, covering the blackened earth of the cemetery. The citizens counted their stolen gold and slept in their beds, believing the nightmare had been averted. But beneath the floorboards, completely unbothered by the religious frenzy, the religious decrees, or the burning of the innocent, the black rats continued to scurry in the dark. A few months later, as the spring thaw arrived and the weather warmed, the Black Death finally breached the walls of Strasbourg. The fleas awoke. The disease erupted with terrifying, unstoppable ferocity. The people who had murdered their neighbors to save themselves found the massive blackened buboes swelling in their own armpits. They coughed blood onto the stolen gold they had pulled from the ashes. The slaughter of the innocent had achieved absolutely nothing. The bacteria did not care about the politics of men, the burning of ledgers, or the frantic search for scapegoats. The true monster was not the Jewish merchant, nor the leper, nor the beggar. The true monster was the microscopic machine of Yersinia pestis, and it was accompanied by a second, equally terrifying monster, the savage, unyielding cruelty of human nature, stripped of its civilized veneer by the sheer, absolute terror of the dark. The Black Death raged on, unimpeded, preparing to drag the remnants of the European continent into the final act of its devastating theatrical tragedy. By the year of our Lord, 1353, the invisible, raging fire that had consumed the European continent finally, slowly, began to burn itself out. The retreat of the Black Death was not a medical victory achieved by the desperate physicians, nor was it a divine pardon granted by the heavens. It was a matter of cold, brutal, and absolute biological mathematics. The microscopic machine of Yersinia pestis had simply run out of fuel. The bacteria had killed so many, so quickly, and with such terrifying efficiency, that there were simply not enough living human hosts left in close proximity to sustain the chain of transmission. The surviving rats retreated into the dark. The starving fleas died in the dust. The invisible army finally ground to a halt. As the heavy, suffocating blanket of the plague slowly lifted, the survivors began to tentatively unbolt their heavy oak doors. They stepped out of their dark, quarantined homes, blinking against the bright sunlight, and walked into the streets of a world that had been fundamentally, violently, and permanently altered. The silence that greeted them was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. The relentless, maddening tolling of the church bells had ceased. The chaotic shouting of the crowded medieval markets was gone. The rhythmic clanking of the blacksmith's hammer, the singing of the tavern bards, the crying of children in the alleyways. All of it had been swallowed by the dark. The death toll was of a magnitude that defies human comprehension. In the agonizing span of barely 5 years, the Black Death had eradicated between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of the European continent. Somewhere between 30 and 50 million human beings had been wiped from the face of the earth. The demographic shock left physical scars upon the landscape that can still be seen today. Across England, France, Italy, and Germany, there were over 1,000 lost villages, settlements that were entirely wiped out, down to the last child. The thatch roofs of the cottages slowly collapsed, rotting into the mud. The vast, meticulously cultivated fields of golden wheat and barley were left entirely untended, the crops withering and dying on the stalk. The intricate networks of irrigation ditches choked with weeds. The dense, ancient forests of Europe, which had been slowly pushed back by centuries of human expansion, suddenly surged forward, reclaiming the abandoned farmlands and swallowing the ruins of the doomed villages. Packs of wolves, emboldened by the profound absence of men, were seen wandering through the overgrown, empty streets on the very outskirts of Paris. Europe was a haunted wasteland. But from this absolute, bottomless abyss of death, the modern world was about to be violently, painfully born. To understand the profound resurrection of society, one must look at the deeply entrenched, oppressive system that ruled the medieval world before the plague: feudalism. For centuries, European society was a rigid, immovable pyramid of iron and blood. At the very top sat the kings and the high nobility, owning all the land. Beneath them were the knights and the clergy. And at the massive, crushing bottom of the pyramid were the peasants, the serfs. The serf was essentially a slave to the soil. They were legally bound to the land of their local lord. They worked from the moment the sun rose until it set, breaking their backs to harvest the grain, of which they were allowed to keep only a miserable fraction to survive, handing the vast majority over to the nobility in the form of taxes and tithes. Because the population of Europe before the plague was incredibly high, human labor was cheap, disposable, and utterly devoid of leverage. If a peasant complained, he could be whipped, starved, or replaced by a dozen other starving men, desperate for a crust of bread. The peasant was told by the church that this hierarchy was ordained by God, and that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. But the Black Death shattered the pyramid of feudalism into 1,000,000 irrecoverable pieces. When the survivors looked out over the vast, overgrown estates of the nobility, they realized a profound, earth-shattering economic truth. The land, the castles, and the gold of the aristocracy were entirely, completely worthless, without the blood, the sweat, and the muscle of the working man to maintain them. The nobility still owned the massive fields, but the fields were empty. The harvest was rotting. The sheep and cattle were wandering aimlessly, dying of neglect. Suddenly, for the very first time in human history, the common laborer held the ultimate power. Human life was no longer cheap. It was the most rare, precious, and desperately needed commodity on the continent. The surviving peasants, who had watched their families die and who had lost all fear of the earthly authorities, refused to return to their chains. They looked at the desperate lords begging for the fields to be ploughed, and they made unprecedented demands. They demanded cash wages instead of mere subsistence. They demanded lower rents. They demanded the absolute freedom to leave the land of their birth and travel to whatever town or lord would pay them the highest price. The nobility was thrown into a state of absolute panic. They attempted to use the law to force the world back into the old mold. In England, the king passed the Statute of Labourers, making it a criminal offence for a peasant to demand higher wages than they were paid before the plague, and forbidding them to leave their lord's land. But the law of man cannot overwrite the brutal laws of supply and demand. The peasants simply ignored the decrees. When the nobility attempted to enforce these oppressive laws with violence, the peasants, emboldened by their newfound worth and hardened by the trauma of the apocalypse, revolted. Massive, bloody uprisings swept across the continent. The Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England saw commoners taking up arms, burning the manors of the nobility and executing the tax collectors. The lords were forced to capitulate. They had to pay the higher wages. They had to lower the rents. The invisible iron chains of serfdom were broken. Wealth, which had been hoarded in the high castles for centuries, began to flow downward. The surviving peasants could suddenly afford to buy better food, wear finer clothes, and even purchase small plots of their own land. A brand new, unprecedented social class began to rise from the ashes of the plague pits, the middle class. The economic engine of the modern capitalist world was sparked to life by the mass death of the medieval workforce. Simultaneously, a profound and irreversible psychological and intellectual revolution was taking place. The people of Europe had experienced the absolute, catastrophic failure of their two most trusted institutions, the medical establishment and the Holy Catholic Church. The physicians had bled the dying, applied crushed emeralds to the buboes, and consulted the alignments of the stars, achieving absolutely nothing. The priests had promised that extreme penance, the burning of the flagellants, and the slaughter of the innocent scapegoats would appease the wrath of God. Yet the death cards had continued to roll. This monumental trauma birthed a new, powerful skepticism. The human mind, feeling abandoned by the heavens, began to turn its gaze downward, looking closely, critically, and empirically at the earth. The blind, dogmatic reliance on ancient texts began to crumble. Before the plague, it was considered a severe sacrilege to dissect a human corpse. Physicians relied entirely on the 1,000-year-old writings of the Greeks. But the sheer volume of the dead and the desperate need to understand what had actually happened broke this taboo. The physicians threw away the ancient, useless scrolls. They took up their scalpels. They began to cut open the bodies of the dead, directly observing the actual, mechanical anatomy of the human form, charting the veins, the organs, and the muscles. This pivot from blind faith and ancient dogma to direct empirical observation and humanism was the direct catalyst for the scientific revolution. The survivors realized that if humanity was to be saved from future apocalypses, they could not wait for miracles. They had to save themselves through science, reason, and human ingenuity. The Renaissance, the great, magnificent explosion of art, science, literature, and philosophy that would illuminate the following centuries, was fertilized directly by the millions of corpses resting beneath the soil. Yet, the trauma of the Black Death left a permanent, haunting scar upon the cultural soul of Europe. The art and literature of the post-plague era became darkly obsessed with the physical, decaying reality of mortality. A new, terrifying artistic motif emerged across the continent, painted on the walls of churches, carved into the wood of the pews, and printed in the early books. It was the danse macabre, the dance of death. In these haunting images, rotting, grinning skeletons are depicted leading the living in a lively, mocking dance toward the grave. But the terrifying brilliance of the danse macabre lies in the identities of the living. The skeletons are not just dancing with the poor, starving peasants. They are locking arms with the wealthy merchant, snatching the crown from the head of the Holy Roman Emperor, and dragging the Pope himself, dressed in his magnificent golden robes, down into the dirt. The Dance Macabre was the ultimate visual manifestation of the great lesson of the plague, memento mori. Remember that you must die. It was a dark, beautiful reminder that all earthly power, all hoarded gold, all noble bloodlines, and all ecclesiastical authority are completely, laughably meaningless in the face of biology. Death is the absolute, undefeated equalizer. The emperor and the beggar rot at the exact same speed in the dark. The Black Death was not merely a tragic parenthesis in the timeline of human history. It was the brutal, agonizing forging of the modern era. It was a massive, continental crucible that burned away the stagnant, oppressive structures of the medieval world, leaving behind a scarred, terrified, but fundamentally liberated humanity. The plague teaches us a terrifying lesson about the fragility of civilization. It reminds us that our great cities of stone, steel, and glass, our vast economies, and our complex social orders are incredibly delicate illusions, easily shattered by the microscopic, invisible forces of the natural world. We are not the absolute masters of this earth. We are merely its fragile tenants, constantly at the mercy of biology. But there is a second, far more profound lesson buried in the ashes of the 14th century. It is a testament to the terrifying, unstoppable resilience of the human animal. When faced with the absolute end of the world, when the heavens fell silent and the medicine failed, when brother abandoned brother and the streets filled with the dead, humanity did not go extinct. They suffered. They lost their minds. They committed acts of unspeakable cruelty in the dark. But ultimately, they survived. They stepped over the mass graves of their ancestors. They picked up their tools and they rebuilt the world. They demanded freedom, they sought the truth, and they painted masterpieces over the ruins of the apocalypse. Somewhere, deep beneath the vast, howling emptiness of the Central Asian steppes, in the absolute, silent dark, the invisible assassin, Yersinia pestis, still sleeps. It waits patiently in the blood of the rodents, holding to its blind biological imperative. But humanity waits as well, no longer blind, no longer waiting for the stars to align, bearing the scars of the past, forever dancing on the edge of the abyss, bound by the eternal, unbroken will to survive the dark.